president of Plant It Wild, and we are just delighted to be ending our season on this high note with pruning. I think pruning is one of those skills that people are really afraid to attack their plants. They know that they can do some serious damage, and knowing how to do it right is a technique. And we're thrilled to have Dr. Robert Schutzki with us this evening. He is a professor emeritus from MSU, studied at Rutgers, and we have heard only glowing things about his tenure at MSU in teaching his horticultural in the department. Okay, Bob, go ahead. Yeah, I have heard, I'm just saying. So let's welcome Bob. After this presentation this evening, he will be with us Friday at 10 a.m. to give us a demonstration on live plants, shrubs. We will be meeting at private property, so you will need to pre-register through the Plant It Wild Gmail account, plantitwild2day with the number 2 at gmail.com, and you will be sent the address, and it's in Benzie County off of Grace Road, so it shouldn't be too far from our folks. So without further ado, hey Bob, teach us how to prune.
Okay. Well, thanks, Cheryl, and thanks, Carolyn, for connecting us together. And so tonight we're going to talk about pruning, and I purposely didn't put pruning native trees and shrubs in the title, because what we're going to do is start with the basics. And so it doesn't matter what we're pruning. When it comes to the science and the practice, there's some basics in biology and botany that we need to cover, and also in plant responses to what we do. Every time we make a cut, the plant is going to respond. And if we have an idea on how it will respond or what we should anticipate it doing, it makes all better sense in terms of how we tackle a particular plant. So the first part of the program is going to go on into the science and the practice. And then we're going to end the program with some specific native trees and shrubs and how we would address them if they are part of your landscape. And when we go to the physical session on Friday, several of the plants that we'll talk about today are at that location. And again, we'll address them based on the science that we've talked about today, and some of the expectations that we can hope to gain by making those cuts. Okay, so when it really comes down to it, anytime we pick up a pruner, we are going to manipulate the plant in such a way that we're gonna try to have it achieve our intent or purpose. And so when you think about pruning, if we just let native plants do what they want to do, then there's no need for pruning shears. But as soon as we think about pruning, we want those plants in some way to either adapt to our expectations or outcomes, or we want to help those plants in terms of curb appeal, or in plant growth and development, and in overall plant health. If we look at the textbook reasons why we prune, we want to maintain plant health. And when maintaining plant health, this has to do with insects and diseases. Based on how the plant develops, it may be developing in such a way that it can cause problems with diseases because of the density of the crown, because of the humidity in the crown, because of the amount of branches and leaves. If we think about insects and how insects will impact the plant, again, when we prune, we can help minimize or have a positive effect on insect and disease development. We want to influence the plant size and plant vigor. Okay, we can prune to reduce the size and vigor of a plant, or we can prune to enhance the size and vigor of the plant. And basically, there's two different ways we do that. If we want to increase or enhance that vigor, we may make heading cuts. If we want to reduce the size and the vigor, we may make thinning cuts. And so how we manipulate what we cut and where we cut has a great deal to do with the overall size and vigor of a plant. Influence on flowering and fruiting. Flower bud development needs light, okay? And then flower buds eventually lead to fruit. And so depending on how the plant is growing, the density of the crown, where light penetration occurs or does not occur, we can have an influence, a positive influence on the flowering and fruiting. If we leave a plant go to its own device and it's growing and it becomes very dense, we may actually inhibit flowering and subsequent pruning. So again, when we think about the science behind pruning, these things are all taken into consideration. Plant architecture. When we think about plant architecture, the scaffold structure of a plant, where its branches are, the distance that the branches are apart, this has a lot to do with its ability to resist heavy winds, to possibly minimize breakage during ice storms and things like that. And so again, we can prune to help a plant resist some of these natural occurrences and again, work in our favor in terms of the overall purpose that we want that plant to serve. Minimize transplant shock. If we are talking about bringing in a new plant, we purchased it at a garden center or a nursery, and we plant it, or I should say, it has been transplanted from a container or from a balled and burlap situation, we can prune to help enhance its initial establishment and development. And so again, if we look at the textbook reasons why we prune, each one of these addresses how we prune, where we prune, and essentially what we prune. When it comes to the practice, we have the artistic and the integration of the scientific principles. So we want to contribute to overall aesthetic appeal. And so that's interesting when we're thinking about native plants, in that, do you want the native plant to do what Mother Nature and its DNA prescribes it to do, or do you want to have some overall influence and manage that plant for your own aesthetic appeal or aesthetic interests? That plant is going to perform a function. When we talk about given function, some of the typical, probably the most common function is screening. We want the plant to develop some type of screen to ward off unpleasant views or whatever. We want that plant to provide a certain amount of shade. And so when we think about the function, again, we're going to look about our pruning principles, our practice, how we prune, what we prune, and where we prune to address those particular functions. Maintaining plant health, I talked about that. When we plant or we're pruning to maintain plant health, we're opening up the plant and increasing air circulation through the crown, because that can help in terms of insects and disease prevention. And then enhance vigor. We have a plant and it just doesn't seem to be growing as vigorous as we would like it to. And so pruning can help. And basically, when we prune to enhance vigor, what we're doing is we're trying to eliminate competition between and among plant parts. And by doing that, we can give the remaining plant parts a jump on growth. Basically, pruning is modifying plant growth. And as soon as you put a pruning shear or a hand shear or a lopper in your hand, you're going to manipulate growth of that particular plant. Every cut initiates a response, and every cut has a subsequent consequence. And so this is something that I will talk about it in the field quite a bit, But again, every time you make a cut, a pruning cut, you should anticipate how the plant will respond. And as it responds, what do you need to do to address that response? When will you have to come back as a consequence of that cut? And so when we talk about pruning and we're out there in the field and we're making these cuts, every time we cut, there's a reason why we cut and where we cut, because we anticipate or we want to stimulate a particular response. And when that response occurs, we may come back to it and make another cut to finish off our objectives. Okay, so plant growth and development. All right, so in every plant we put into our landscape, every plant that we think about purchasing, we should have a rough idea on these particular factors. What the plant natural form is, branch angles, shoot length, typical internode length, and the bud orientation. Because there are these things will help us understand not only how will the plant act, but how our pruning will result in our particular outcomes. There's two types of growth. There's decurrent growth and excurrent growth. And decurrent growth essentially is a plant that throws up a shoot, buds break, and it causes laterals. Those laterals grow and break buds again. And so a decurrent growth form is a overall rounded growth form. There's not a central leader like you'll see in the excurrent growth. And so in these particular plants, they want to be rounded in their form by nature. And anything we prune, we can either work with their particular form or we work against it. And we work against it, then it leads to more consequences on those cuts. An excurrent form is typically strong central leader. And we see this on our evergreen trees. Okay, and if you look at this, the evergreen shoot goes up. Okay, let me see here. It shoots up, and when it stops, lateral buds break, and it makes that conical shape that we see in this particular spruce and the conical shape that we see in this particular arborvitae. Central leader that's strong in terms of its dominance, and then the laterals are somewhat subordinate to that central leader. And so the plant always wants to have a strong central leader, whereas in the decurrent growth, when one branch grows, it's not necessarily causing subordination of other branches. They're all kind of growing at the same particular rate. It's real important for us to know, okay, and then this when it comes down to it, very applicable for native plants. We need to know what the natural form of that plant is. We need to know where the branches originate, what patterns they provide, and how they overlay and overlap. Okay, and so when you look at this plant on the left, you'll see that everything starts from this crown at the base, and you can trace these branches up through the crown. They have some secondary branches and tertiary branches coming off of the main branch, but they're basically, if I'll just arbitrarily say there's 30 different branches all stemming from the base, and they're all growing up at a certain rate that's forming this rounded canopy. Every time we make a cut on one of these branches, it's going to cause a modification in growth. And how we make that cut will determine whether the plant looks like it should, or we've manipulated it and distorted its overall canopy. This plant on the right, and this is typical of Physocarpus. So if you have any 9-barks in your landscape, this is how 9-bark grows. It comes from a crown at the base. It forms a branch up, and it arches, up and it arches, up and it arches. And that's where it gets that overall cascading outline that you typically see in physocarpet. If I cut this up at the top, I'm going to cause a distortion in its growth, and there'll be a proliferation of buds wherever I make that cut in this particular area, and it's going to distort the overall canopy. But if I cut it down lower into the plant, and my arrow is somewhat difficult to see, but if I cut it down lower, then some of the buds that initiate are going to grow up and they're going to eventually arch. And so there's a Physocarpus diabolo at the house that we're going to see on Friday. And it's a classic in terms of this habit. And when we get there, and we'll go and look at it, we'll see where they have made cuts in the past, and we'll see how that plant responds. And this is, if there's one thing that I got across to you folks tonight, is that if we understand how the plant wants to grow, we can do we can be a lot better in terms of pruning it if we want it to maintain its natural shape. Okay, if we're gonna distort it into some type of landscape form that fits our particular desire, then we may be fighting against certain plants. And in that case, quite often, if it doesn't do what you want it to do with your pruning, then you need to consider a different plant. Okay, here's a situation here on the left. And when we were at Crystal Ridge, we saw some viburnums that were sheared year after year after year. This is a typical structure of the viburnum that was sheared, and it was sheared into more of an oval form than the horizontal layering that the plant wants to grow like. And so if we look at its internal branch origination, its branch patterns, overlay and overlap, that's going to help us tailor our pruning practice to meet or I should say, work with the overall habit of the plant, and maybe be much more successful in our pruning endeavors. When it comes to weeping, okay, there are cultivars of native plant species that are weeping in their form. And some of you may know of some of the weeping redbuds. Cercis canadensis, eastern redbud, is a Michigan native. It's native along the Kalamazoo River. Actually, if you look at the 94 corridor, eastern redbud is abundant down in that particular area. There's several weeping cultivars, and if we're looking at weepers, and one of the things we need to look at is, how does the branch weep? Does it go up and then cascade down? Does it go cascade directly down? And so when it comes to weepers, quite often I go into the trunk itself, and I'll show you this a little later, into the trunk and look out, and it helps me indicate which branches I should take out without affecting the overall crown and canopy. Okay, when it comes to evergreens, and there are some junipers that are native. Taxus canadensis is a native. And again, when we think about where the branches occur, how they overlap and overlay, it helps with our pruning. For example, if you're going to have something like this in your landscape, okay, there's what I call lights and darks. Where I see the foliage, it's a light. Where I don't see the foliage and there appears to be holes, that's darks. The darks are actually holes that let light penetrate deeper into the crown, and light penetration deeper into the crown helps initiate new foliage buds. And so there's a benefit. And so when I'm looking at a natural pruning of an evergreen, I like to balance the lights and the darks across the crown. So in this particular case, when we're looking at some of this, I could use a couple of more holes in here, so that when I look across, it looks like the darks and the lights are in balance. And it's a very selective, strategic method of pruning. Natural form and branch density. All right. And so when you look at the plant, that's the same trees, look at the image on the left. If you look at it, you can see in the upper part of the crown, I see sky. Okay. In the lower part of the crown, I don't see any sky. It's all branches. If you look at the image on the right, you can see the sky in the upper 2/3 of the plant, but down close to the trunk where it's originating, I see the heavy branches. One way we can prune in the winter, or I should say in the dormant season, is looking at the balance of, again, lights and darks. And so when we came to prune these particular trees, they're crab apples. When we came to prune them, what we did is we used the balance. We use the lights and dark relationship here, and this is where we focus most of our attention. We focused our attention here so that I could see the sky here the same way as I see the sky in the upper part. And then once I had that baseline established, then I started going into the interior of the plant and starting to cut a little bit more and opening up the crown. My reason for opening up the crown was so that light penetrated deeper into the crown. It initiated flower buds deeper into the crown and then subsequent fruit. A lot of times with crab apples, although I understand it may not be one of your preferred plants in your landscape, that a lot of times as the crab apples develop, the flowering is limited to the exterior part of the crown. And that's basically because light limitations. And so in any native plant, if you have a heavy, dense canopy, for example, I could think about redbud, I could think about Cornus alternifolia, the pagoda dogwood. I can think about even serviceberry. If the crown becomes so dense that light doesn't penetrate deeper into that crown, then I'm going to restrict my flower bud formation and my subsequent fruiting to the outer limits of the crown. So in branch density, if you're looking at or you're thinking about doing your pruning, look at, even if you sit on the ground and you look up through the canopy to the sky and see how much open or closed your canopy is. And that's a great way to start with your pruning cuts. When it comes to branch density with evergreens, all right, it's the same thing. As light penetrates through on the juniper on the right, you can see these little dark, I'll call them holes, but those dark spaces allow the sunlight to penetrate deeper in. And as a result, the wood there initiates vegetative buds. And so that if I do have an issue with mechanical ice load or some other type of injury, those buds will initiate new growth. When it comes to, in this particular case, it's a mugo pine, it's not a native, but when it comes to these scaffolds on pines, and we'll see it later on white pine, the scaffolds are important because of the way pines grow. So I have laterals here. This shoot was a central. I have laterals here, and then this shoots. Next year, when these buds break, I'll have laterals here and then a shoot. But again, when that occurs, and see here, you can see it's very open, and I have needles for practically the full length of the plant. Here's a weeping plant, and one of the things that I talked about is quite often I'll go and I'll sit underneath it and look up through. Okay, if you look up through the canopy, it gives you a good idea of where the overlaps are, where there's some conflicting branches. And again, when you start to see these buds break, if you waited until the leaves started to emerge, it's going to give you a good idea on the density and where you should thin it out and open up that plant for more productivity in terms of flowers and subsequent fruit. Okay, branch angle. Most people are aware of branch angle, and basically what I mean by branch angle is where that lateral branch comes off of its point of origin. Okay, these branch angles, the angle that's from here to there, the angle from here to there, branch angle has a lot to do with wood strength. All right, if we think about ice load and breakage that occurs with ice load, if we think about strong wood versus weak wood, a lot has to do with the connection in the branch angle. And this is what I would like you to think about. The wider the branch angle, in other words, the more the branch coming off of a main trunk is, the more horizontal it is, it causes a difference in the development of wood. Okay, so if you look at these wood fibers here, this is a much stronger connection in terms of the lateral, and this can withstand a lot more weight than something that has narrow angles. This, you see these little black dots in here? This is called a bark inclusion. All right, when these branches were young, the bark actually came down into here. And as the branches began to grow and they developed some caliper, the bark stayed in there, and the wood fibers kind of grew around it. But these bark inclusions in here weaken the wood. So in this particular case, you get breakage. And so this is classic. All right, this is a peach tree. Okay, peach trees have a tendency to have upright vertical branches. And what happened here is that the weight of the peaches and the branches, here's that bark inclusion coming down into it, and the weight causes this to break off. And so the point being, any plant that you're trying to increase the wood strength to protect its lateral branch growth, you want to try to prune or train those lateral branches to a more horizontal orientation, because that's how that wood strength will develop. Okay, annual shoot length, typical internode length, and bud orientation. All right, and these are the botanical terms that the terminal buds, the nodes are actually lateral buds. The internodes are the distance between the lateral buds. Terminal bud scars is where the bud scars are from on the terminals as they develop. You have lateral buds, dormant buds, stem collar, shoulder ring. So all these botanical terms, okay, it seems so textbook, but I'll show you what all that means. And it's actually pretty simple when we're out in the field. Okay, so here you have two shoots. This is the terminal shoot. So these scales that are on these terminal buds, those are the terminal bud scales. All right, that terminal bud is formed at the end of the shoot. These lines here are the terminal bud scales from last year. So this, if you envision this bud down here, when growth started in the spring, this shoot grew this much. And then when it stopped growing, it formed this terminal bud. So this is its annual growth, the distance between the tip to its previous tip. These are lateral buds or nodes. Here's lateral buds. Here's lateral buds. This is the internode length, the distance between the lateral buds. All right, look at this other shoot. Terminal bud scars from the previous season, terminal bud scars from the previous season, terminal bud scars, and you look at this, last year's growth or this year's growth is a few inches. Last year's growth was a little less. The year before that, it was a lot less. And then the year before that, it was pretty long. This is typical of transplanting. When you transplant a plant, you'll have the growth that occurred in the nursery or wherever it was growing before transplanting. This is transplant year. It's growing out of its transplant, but still transplant shock. And in the third season, it starts to grow a little bit longer. The point being is that when you start to prune a plant, you need to look at its growth, its annual growth rate, because that tells you how well it's developing. It tells you how its vigor. And if I have a situation like this, and I knew that this plant was transplanted or planted 3 years ago, I expect this. If this plant was in the ground for 10 years and I saw this, it's not growing very well. And so that leads me to try to determine what's happening with this particular plant and how will my pruning invigorate that growth. Phyllotaxy, or the bud arrangement orientation, we have alternate, opposite, and whorled. And so in an alternate arranged plant, here's the terminal bud, the second bud from it, third bud from it, fourth bud from it. They're alternate sides of the stem. And when we get into the heading cuts in a little while, the thing that I want you to know is that every time you make a heading cut, you've initiated or invigorated the buds from 2 to 4 points behind the cut. So if I made this cut here, I'm going to invigorate potentially these 3 buds. Not any buds further from it, but always wherever I make the cut, that's where I'm going to initiate most of my growth response. And so here for alternate, it's very easy to see how these are an alternate side of the stems. Opposite, they're exactly opposite each other. We see them here, we see them here, we see them here. Okay, we see them here on this hydrangea. In this particular case, when I make the pruning cut, both of these buds will develop. And in some cases, and I'll show you in a minute, that's not desirable. So if I'm looking at a plant and I see that it's opposite arrangement, it's going to change the way I make the cut. Whorled means that we have three stems, 3 buds originating from the same place. So this is a hydrangea paniculata limelight. And in this particular case, I have this dead stalk up here, which you can't, my arrow's not, there it is. This is a spent flower from last year, but 3 stems initiated after growth began that particular season. So it's whorled, but in some cases, you'll only see 2, 1 will abort. Here's another example of that limelight where 3 stems had originated in this whorled position on that stem. Again, if I have a plant that has a whorled arrangement, it's going to change or modify the way that I make a cut. Apical dominance. Okay, apical dominance is important to know for current season's growth. All right, this is a physocarpus, so this is 9-bark. Okay, and you can see this 9-bark stem is 3 feet plus long. Okay, that shoot has grown. When it grew, it kept growing. None of these lateral buds broke. And they don't break because of apical dominance. What that means is that the hormone auxin that's synthesized and produced in the tip, it inhibits the breaking of lateral buds on the current season. All right, and that's important because in this particular case with this physocarpus, all this shoot can grow, and then when it stops growing next year, the only buds that are going to break are going to be right here. And there will be no laterals coming up here because of the nature of apical dominance. And so when I make a cut, if I make a cut here, this is where the buds are going to develop. If I make a cut there, this is where the buds are going to develop. So you can direct how you can direct where you will get lateral growth on many plants based on where you make the cut. And this is a spruce. Okay, if you look at the spruce, it's growing up, growing up. The terminal bud is formed here, but the apical dominance prevented these buds from breaking. These 4 buds or these six branches that you have here were last year's growth. Next year, when this shoot starts growing, roughly 4 or 6 of these buds will break. And so again, you'll see a little bit later how important that is. And so when it comes down to pruning conifers, based on where I have the buds, based on the distance between bud growth between here and here, okay, that's something I need to consider. Otherwise, I'm going to have a very leggy plant. In fact, if you think about the Christmas tree growers, when they do their pruning, they want a specific distance between last year's world and this year's world. And a lot of times it's anywhere from 6 to 8 inches, depending on the species. And I'll show you in a few slides what that means. Okay, basic pruning cuts. Everything that we do in pruning is either a heading cut or a thinning cut. And a heading cut is when the branches are cut directly above a bud. A thinning cut is when you cut the branch off at its point of origin. So in a heading cut, you're just nipping above a bud. A thinning cut, you're taking the entire branch off down to its point of origin. Heading cuts, the regrowth is vigorous from the buds behind the stub, okay? And it usually forms a compact head. So one of the things, again, that I would like you to take home message, every time you make a heading cut, you should anticipate 2 to 4 buds behind that cut breaking and giving you new growth. When you make a thinning cut, there's no immediate impact, and any regrowth or any balancing of new growth is distributed over the whole crown. You can't see any direct impact when you make a thinning cut. And so in some cases, if I want to invigorate growth, I want to increase growth, I make a heading cut. If I want to reduce the size of a plant, if I want to minimize any vigor, I make thinning cuts. If you make heading cuts with the idea of reducing growth, it's going to come back gangbusters, and you're going to wind up having to prune more in the subsequent season than you thought. But if I make thinning cuts, then I can reduce that plant the way I want to. Heading cuts, 45-degree angle, 1/4 inch above the bud. Okay, and this is kind of an old graphic, but it serves the purpose. If I cut this on an angle and it's too short, it's too close to the bud, the vascular connections, the xylem tissue going into that bud dries up and dies, and that bud will die. So if you look at the one furthest on the right, if it's too short, these connections dry, this bud dies, this will be a decayed stub, and this bud will grow. If I make it too long above the bud or too far above the bud, this bud will grow, but this will decay and dry up, because essentially, in order for water to get up into the plant, these active shoot growing draws the water up. This is too far away from this bud. Water's not drawn up here. It dries, dies, decays. So this is like the 3 little bears, you know. When it comes down to here, the 1/4 inch, it allows water that's being pulled up by this shoot. It allows it to maintain in this area, and you'll get callus closure. Okay, the other thing about this 45-degree angle, if you know the way in this, see this little line in there? That's the cambium. And the cambium is what initiates the wound closure. Cambium does not grow like this. It grows this way. By cutting it on an angle, you're allowing the cambium tissue that's here, here, here to eventually close in and heal that wound. If you made a flat cut, the cambium dries out and then you have a stub. And I'll show you in a minute. Okay, here's a arrowwood viburnum, Viburnum dentatum. It's an opposite arranged plant. Okay, the pruning cut was made above the buds. So this is a heading cut, and the heading cut caused these 2 buds to break. But the fact that this was cut too far above the bud, this is going to be a dead, decaying stub that's eventually going to cause problems on the particular plant. However, on opposite arranged plants, we cut on that 45-degree angle and eliminate one of the buds. By doing that, we give this bud chance to grow. And if you look where these leaves are, everywhere you see leaves, you'll have buds. And that these opposite buds here will break and eventually grow like that. So by sacrificing one of the buds on an opposite arranged plant, you're actually working in better favor for the development and eliminating any particular stubs. Okay, heading cuts. I talked about this and mentioned it. Anytime you make a heading cut, you're cutting it directly above a bud. Where you cut, which bud that you choose to cut above, keep in mind that 2 to 4 buds behind it is going to break. So back when we get that 9 bark that we have here, this is summer wine 9 bark, by the way. When I look at this, if I cut there, there's where my growth is going to occur. And if I have 1, 2, 3, 4 shoots, I cut this one here, growth. 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 So you can stagger where you cut, where you make those heading cuts to give you more crown density. All right. Again, every time you make a cut, you should anticipate where growth is going to respond, how it's going to respond, and whether or not you're going to get what you intend. Okay, thinning cuts are cut in the center of the shoulder rings in the stem collar. Okay, so when we do a thinning cut, all these plants, these stems here, if we did a thinning cut here, we'd cut it right back there. If we did a thinning cut, we'd cut it there. If we wanted to make a thinning cut on this, we would cut it there. It goes back to the origin of that particular specific branch. Okay, shoulder rings or flans. There's Alex Shigo was a forester quite a number of years ago, and he did extensive studies on cuts and wound healing. And he found out that through his research, see this thing here? That's the shoulder ring. There's the shoulder rings here. It almost looks like a rippling of skin, okay, wrinkling of skin. And the reason you cut in the shoulder rings is because there's active cambium. And active cambium closes the wounds quicker. This is a red maple, Acer rubrum. You see these rippled? That's the shoulder rings. And so when Alex Shigo first came out with it, a lot of people misinterpreted where the shoulder rings are. And they made cuts out here. And they thought, well, if I cut on the outside of that shoulder ring, that's even better. No, because it was a flat cut and cambium doesn't grow this way, and it caused a stub. And in the old days, we used to make flush cuts on the trunk, but with the flush cuts, the wounds were a lot larger and they took a lot longer to close. So when Shigo came up with his work in these shoulder rings, we make the cut, activates the cambium, we get wound closure quicker, and it's a lot better in the overall health of the plant. Here's a situation where people made their cuts. They made the cuts too far out, and you can see all these dead and decayed branches, and that causes problems in the trunk. But right there is the shoulder ring. There is the shoulder ring. There is the shoulder ring. And so when you're pruning your trees, for example, and you want to take some lateral branches off, make sure you look and see where the shoulder rings are, and that's where you make your cuts. Okay, wound closure and cambium activity. Okay, here's a whole bunch of wounds. You can see this is the callus bead that's going to close that wound. You can see here the callus bead that's closing the wound here and here. And so when this cut was made in the shoulder rings, it initiated the callus formation here. We call it the callus bead, and then eventually that closes in and solidifies it. Okay, now the question was, do I paint? The question is paint or no paint? And what Shigo found out is that painting is actually bad for the plant. All right, painting seals in moisture, and if there's any fungal spores or any decay mechanisms, that moisture initiated that decay. However, if the wound was left open and it dried, the plant does its compartmentalization, and it separates the drying edge from the internal moist part. So the point being is that no paint, okay? The only time we paint, okay, the fruit growers will paint because they add a fungicide in the paint, and they paint the wounds, especially with peaches, and that fungicide helps eliminate some of the canker diseases that are prevalent on fresh wounds. But when it comes to a plant that we don't have to worry about any canker diseases or any spores flying around, we don't paint anymore. Okay, timing. We consider, when do we prune? Based on the plant type, the condition, the desired outcome, and the scheduling. Okay, so every cut initiates a response. Every cut leads to a set of consequences. And so when you're looking at this cut led to these two shoots to develop and a stub. So I would come back and cut this on an angle to eliminate one of those and eliminate that problem. Natural form. When we think about pruning shrubs, this is a double file viburnum. Look at the horizontal layers. This is Annabelle hydrangea. It grows up from the crown in a straight stalk, forms its terminal flower head. Okay, in the Caryopteris, it does the same. And so once I understand the natural form of the plant, and here's some junipers, in this particular case, the junipers are horizontal layers. In this one, sea green, they're upright fans. In the taxus, again, feathery shoots. If I understand what the natural form of the plant is, it'll help me with pruning. Okay, so we get back to some of these slides about branch origin, overlap, overlay, and then the patterns, okay? And so again, what I'd like you to consider when you look at a plant, where are the branches originating? How do they throw laterals? Where are they growing and forming the crown? And again, it helps you in terms of determining where to cut. So look in this particular case. This branch is coming up. It grew 3 foot plus in a season. I have all these lateral buds. It's a horizontal, or it's an opposite branch plant. If I cut here, I'm going to get growth there. I cut here, I get growth here. And so you can manipulate where you get your regrowth from based on where you make your cuts. Here's a physocarpus. And the reason I took this, you can see physocarpus, everything starts, it comes out. I took this just for these 2 branches. They prune this branch here and there, and look at how the distorted growth occurred right at the tips. It's different than what you see at the tips here. So here, here, and then here is because of where they made the cut. They wanted to reduce this plant by a foot or so, so they made a cut there only to stimulate the growth in that area, and it distorts the overall crown of the plant. Here, this is a limelight hydrangea. We have terminal flowers. We have these flower stalks and the shoots behind it. And so when it comes to pruning hydrangeas, you make the cuts where you see lateral buds, because that's where you're going to get a growth response. And then the next year on those new shoots, that's where your flower buds are going to form. Okay, here's another in terms of, you can see where everything starts in the crown. In this one here, it comes up. Okay, multi-stems, its density here. And so again, when I look at it, it tells me how it wants to grow. I figure out what I want from the plant, and then I make my cuts accordingly. Okay, this is important here in terms of evergreens. Here's a white pine, and you see this hourglass effect? This is what was done in the nursery. It was planted, and it is planted on campus. And so it's somewhat embarrassing because we're supposed to know what to do with these things. But anyway, so this was brought in, planted on campus from the nursery, and then it was let go. And then the white pine started growing, and it was growing back to its natural form. And so its natural form is here. Its natural growth rate is here. This is its nursery growth rate. And so in order for us to really do this right, we should have transitioned by pruning this back into its natural growth so this can catch up with it. Here's a spruce, same thing, a white spruce. And so you can see this was its nursery growth. All of a sudden, it established and went back to its normal growth rate. We have this central shoot here. It threw, right here was a terminal. It threw some laterals. This is this past year's growth, formed a terminal bud. Next year, we'll have laterals here, and all this is vacant. So again, by understanding how a plant will come through transplanting and where it goes from transplant shock back into its natural growth will help us in terms of pruning. Okay, here's that white pine again, a different white pine. This is normal growth rate on a healthy white pine, 3 foot plus in its terminal shoot. And then it throws these laterals on its terminal head, and this shoot is continuing to grow. And so there's we call these whorls. And the distance between this whorl and this whorl in this particular case is probably as much as 2 feet. But that doesn't give us the density we want for that pine. So when it comes to the native pines, the native spruces, the native firs, by understanding how it wants to grow, we help it by transitioning it back into its normal growth rate from the nursery growth. All right. Pruning trees, natural form. These are native plants, okay? This one here on the left, okay, you can see it's a pagoda dogwood. This is flowering dogwood, serviceberry. all Michigan natives. And you see the way they grow their natural form. Each one of these, this one's in horizontal layers. This one has some layers, but it's more open. The serviceberry is more vase-shaped in its form. That's going to help me determine how to prune it. Okay, here's a witch hazel on the left, Hamamelis virginiana, the common and native witch hazel. This one here is a viburnum. It's Viburnum prunifolium that quite often develops into a small tree, but how it's growing naturally and how it wants to grow naturally will help us in terms of pruning. All right, when it comes to a lot of things that happen and not in the native plant world, but there's a landscape form. Anytime you take a pruner in hand and you start to prune, the question will be, are you going to develop it and enhance its natural form? Are you going to impose a landscape form on it? Okay, crown density. Crown density is important because crown density minimizes the depth of foliage, it minimizes flower bud formation, fruit formation, and it works against a plant's natural form. All right, so the whole thing about crown density, you can see here, we want light to penetrate in the crown, we want buds to form, vegetative and flowering, and we want air to circulate through that crown to minimize disease pressure. Crown density, when you look at these particular plants, that plant was sheared so many years, look at how dense it is, only 4 inches from the outside of that crown. There are no, if I spread this a little bit deeper in here, you would see no foliage, no lateral bud development, bare stems. Okay, here's a good shot in the winter. And in this particular case, you can see where the plants were pruned, and every time they were pruned, primarily heading cuts, it increased the bud break, increased the bud break. All right, nothing's really happening down here. And so again, by shearing in this particular case, by making heading cuts, we're going to distort the overall plant. This is a typical red twig dogwood. This is typical Bailey's red twig dogwood. So it's a native species. Okay, and this particular one, Bailey's for some reason develops a lot of dead cankered wood in the crown when it's pruned heavily. And so in this particular case, my recommendation here would be to cut it off at the base and rejuvenate the plant. And once we rejuvenate the plant, we can go in there and selectively prune it correctly so that we eliminate the development of these cankered stems. Okay, depth of foliage. If I have leaves, I have potential future buds. If I have no leaves, there are buds there, but they're dormant or latent. And so if I invigorate growth to produce new leaves on new stems, I produce new buds to give me new branches, depending on if and when I want those. Okay, depth of foliage, same thing on the evergreens. We saw this before, and it has to do with these lights and darks. At the house we're going to, there weren't any evergreens, but I can explain that once we get out there. Okay, rejuvenation, renovation, and cutbacks. Okay, this plant right here is a blue Arctic willow. Okay, and you can see how gnarly it is. And this is where it's cut back to the trunk. Okay, when we do renovations or rejuvenations or cutbacks, what we want to do is eliminate the entire top, cut it at the base, and regenerate new growth. Okay, we can do that with marginally hardy plants. We can do that to eliminate really problem crown density. We can maintain size, we can enhance. So the science behind it is pretty good. In this particular case, here's a variegated red twig dogwood. Here is Bailey's red twig dogwood. And you can see in this particular case, multi-stems at the base. They plant this here, I would imagine, to hide this electrical box. But when you look at how the crown developed up here, really distorted. And so what we would do here, cut this off at the base. And as the new shoots are developing, we stagger cut those at different heights. It gives us branching right down to the base of the plant, and we get a much better plant. In this particular case, with this red twig dogwood, Cornocerecia, we cut this off at the base, and as the new plants are regenerating, or I should say the new stems are regenerating, we start to stagger cut and again get a much better plant. Same thing with this plant here. This is a spirea, but there's a lot of natives that will grow in this manner as well. Okay, this is just a kind of a story. This was on campus, right at our Hort Gardens. This is what the blue Arctic willow looked like in the dormant season. We cut it down to the base. Okay, this was cut down in March. This was the plant in the first week of June. That's how it responded. This was the plant in August. So what we did is we took this down to this, and we got back to this in that first season. So when we rejuvenate or we renovate or we do cutbacks, we're actually doing that to bring back a plant that's much better for us. Okay, there's a situation here. This here was a Viburnum carlesi. Here was another viburnum, and this was a Viburnum dentatum. They were all cut down at the base. What we would do, it's like, let's look at the middle image. What I would do here is that when that plant has started to grow, I'll just guess and say there's 15 new stems that came up. I'll take half of them out, prune them right out. And then the 7 or 8 that are left, I'll stagger prune those at different heights, and I'll get a full plant the next season. Actually, if I do it early enough in the spring, those laterals will break in this current season. This Viburnum dentatum was cut down at the base. You can see how it came up. The same thing. I take half of this growth out at the base. I leave some strategically located branches. I stagger cut them at different height, and it gives me around the top. At the house that we're going to on Friday, there's a Viburnum dentatum there that's very dense, kind of squatty, and we'll be able to see we'll be able to look at that plant in this light. Holes. Holes are gaps in the plant. Here's a big hole. Here's some little holes. And the whole idea, if you have a hole in your plant, you prune around the sides of the holes with heading cuts. You initiate the new growth from those buds, and they close the hole. And so in many cases, when you have ice damage, mechanical damage, something where you think, oh, there's this gaping hole in the plant, you take out your pruning shears and you start making heading cuts around there. Every time you make a cut, you're making a cut at a bud that you're going to direct the growth to fill that hole. Outliers. Outliers are here, here, and here. The thing about outliers, they're a vigorous stem that comes up from the main crown. And in this particular case, where's my pointer here? In this particular case, this outlier, some people will just prune it off right at the edge of the crown. If they did that, they made a heading cut, and what they did is initiated growth here. Next year, it's going to come back in the same case. So when you have outliers that are going beyond the crown that you want, and you want to bring it back into shape, you make thinning cuts. You cut these off at its origin, and you're not going to get that immediate impact with new growth. Okay, so all of these particular outliers, you go back into the plant through its origin, cut it. You go back into the plant at its origin, you go back in the stem into its origin, and you cut it off by a thinning cut. All right, we're going to go through a whole bunch of different native plants, and this is what I want you to consider. Do I want natural form or do I want a landscape form? And so natural form, you're either gonna work with the plant and enhance its overall form and you clean it up a little bit with your pruning, or you're going to impose a landscape form that fits into your desired aesthetics. Okay, pagoda dogwood, Cornus alternifolia, great. It's one of my favorite natives. All right, horizontal layers. Very interesting plant. This is a Michigan native. In fact, I could take a walk 10 minutes from my house in Benzonia, and I can show you native pagoda dogwood growing in the edges. Okay, it grows in some moist areas. It'll grow in some dry areas. Great plant for spring flowers, summer fruit, fall color, and then burgundy branches in the winter. But in this particular case, this is heavily branched. And so as long as I want to maintain its natural form, I'll prune horizontal in layers and open it up. Serviceberry, okay? Serviceberry usually is multi-trunked. When I think about serviceberry, if you're going to buy serviceberry at a nursery or garden center, it's going to come possibly in two ways. The nursery industry calls serviceberry with multiple trunks heavy. When they indicate that it's a heavy clump, that means there's a lot of stems. That means in a heavy clump, there could be anywhere from 10 to 15 stems in that plant. In this particular case, you can see there's maybe 5, there's maybe 7, there's maybe 5, 6. When you have heavy serviceberries, they develop a really nice, dense, compact crown at the expense of height growth. If you limit the amount of stems in there, you modify that growth from dense, tight crown growth to height growth. So if I have when I look for serviceberries, I look for serviceberry clumps with 3 to 5 stems in it, because I know when I plant it and it starts to establish, I can get the height that I want out of it, because I just don't want this entire lower mass. And so in many cases, if we go to a nursery and then we see one that has 10 stems in it, and if I choose that one to buy, I'll bring it home and cut 5 of them out. And people look at me like, you're nuts. You just bought this clump with 10 stems in it, but you're taking 5 of them out. Why? Because I want height growth, not to maintain this low, heavy mass. Witch hazel. Witch hazel is a rangy, wide plant. And if you look at this particular witch hazel, they're usually fairly open. And so I would call this crown irregular. If you like the irregular crown of witch hazel, then just leave it alone. If you don't like the crown, maybe you trim off a couple of these, you give it a little bit more shape. It's a little bit dense here. I may open it up. I may prune in here to encourage a little bit more branching. Again, it becomes a very strategic, selective pruning to address exactly what you want. Okay, Carpinus caroliniana, Eastern hornbeam. This one is another favorite of mine. It's broad spreading, multi-strung. Common name for this is ironwood. Really nice, not not great in terms of its flower, but its fruit, its cascading fruit is interesting. But again, in this particular case, I would thin out. There would be probably no heading cuts on this plant, but I would do a tremendous amount of thinning cuts to open it up, air circulation, let light penetrate deeper into the crown. Okay, Astraea virginiana, hop hornbeam. Hop hornbeam is a Michigan native. In fact, they're all around here. A real nice shade tree, and the hops, the fruit on there, they're interesting to look at, nice fall color. And so in this particular case, this is going to be a medium shade tree for me. And in fact, in this, the density here is fine. All right, I may do some light pruning. I won't have to doctor up the outline of this plant because it's going to give me it on its own, on its natural form. The only thing I could do here is elevate the lower branches to service my turf or to sit underneath it or do whatever. Okay, you saw these already. This is a white pine. Anytime I'm going to purchase a white pine from a nursery that has been pruned or sheared, I have to think about transitioning from that sheared form to its natural form. The same thing with spruce. The smaller, this is a difficult comment, okay? The smaller the plant that's acceptable, the easier it is for the transition. So for example, if I go in the nursery and I see 6 to 8 footers, and I see 5 to 6 footers, and I look at the density and how they're growing, I may want the 6 to 8 foot plant, but I'll buy the 5 to 6 because I know it'll develop in a few more years, and I can transition that, easier. On that white pine, if I see a white pine that was loosely pruned, I'll buy that one every time. Why? Because when it transitioned, it won't have this hourglass effect as a plant that's sheared. And so there are a whole bunch of nurseries out there that when they're wholesale nurseries, they sell to the trade, and the trade will say, do you have any loosely pruned plants? And they say, no, we basically do most of our shearing. Well, thanks, I'm not interested. And then they find a nursery that has loosely pruned plants that gives it more of that natural overall crown. Black chokeberry, Aronia melandocarpa. Okay, so when you look at Aronia, Michigan native, great plant, 6 to 8 feet, great fall color, blue-black fruit, persists in the winter, like some wet soils, a really nice plant. Now, one of the things that my question to you as Planted Wild, what do you consider acceptable natives? Are cultivars of native species acceptable? Because there's some thoughts are that as soon as there's human intervention in a plant selection and clonally propagating, that's not necessarily desirable. So if you accept cultivars and you like black chokeberry, there are a few new cultivars on the market that are lower in growing. That there's one that's called low-scape hedger that's in the 3 to 5 foot range. There's another one, low-scape mound, that's in the 1.5 to 2.5 foot range. So it's a cultivar of a native species that gives you more size control. Okay, Cephalanthus occidentalis buttonbush. Buttonbush is a rangy, wild, irregular plant in the swamps. Okay, when you bring it into the landscape, it wants to be rangy, so you have to prune it a fair amount to give it some shape, or I should say some landscape form. There's a cultivar called Sugar Shack that was developed for its more compact habit. So again, if cultivars of native species are acceptable, you may find some native species cultivars that give you the size control you want, that maybe give you a different flower or fall color display, but gives you the site adaptability that's so desirable with our native plants. Okay, red twig dogwood. One of the things that you should know about red twig dogwood is depending on which red twig you buy, how long do the stems stay red? All right, and so when you get Cornus sericea straight species, the burgundy stems are 1 year old. And when you get to 2-year-old wood, they're already starting to turn gray and brown. By 3 years old, they're gray and brown. When you look at Bailey's red twig dogwood, the reason Bailey's was selected as a cultivar because its red stems stay red for approximately 4 years old. When you buy a red twig dogwood or you buy a red twig dogwood cultivar, one of the questions you would ask your supplier is how old, or I should say, how old was the wood before it turns from red? And they may say, well, this will be red for 2 seasons. This will be red for 3 seasons. And the other thing you should know about the red twig dogwoods, the current season growth is the most colorful. So many people renovate their red twigs every 3 to 4 years to replenish it with the most colorful wood. And so you don't let it get big and rangy and widespreading. You do it to maintain winter stem color. Okay, Daravilla lanicera, the northern dwarf bush honeysuckle. This is a Michigan native. We find it especially, and we're going up towards the straits. If you've ever been on Mackinac Island, Daravilla is all over the place in the shrubs along the trails. A really nice Michigan native. Now, one of the things that keep in mind, lanicera is the native. Daravilla sessilifolia is the southern dwarf bush honeysuckle. It's a North American native, but from the south. But it's hardy for us here in Michigan. The other thing is you may see the Daravilla Kodiak series, Kodiak orange, Kodiak red, Kodiak black. This is a hybrid that was developed by crossing 3 different Daravillas, all North American natives. But again, so depending on what their desirability is in terms of native, true natives, or hybrids or cultivars, Daravilla lanicera is our native. It's a very moundy shrub, and again, everything stems from the crown. Really nice fall color, tiny, delicate yellow flowers, and its new growth emerges usually with its fall color. Physocarpus opulifolius, the 9-bark. Everybody knows 9-bark in terms of the purple leaf varieties, but the native is green leaf. In fact, you can find Physocarpus all around the northern part of the Lower Peninsula, and you can see from the image in the upper left that it has these large cascading arching like branches. The yellow one is Dart's Gold. The one with the purple leaves and the white flower is Tiny Wine. The thing that's so interesting about Physocarpus is Physocarpus has been selected for a whole bunch of different ornamental characteristics. So again, depending on what your interests are in terms of either straight species or cultivars, you can get a lot of versatile use out of Physocarpus opulifolius 9-bark. Okay, Sambucus canadensis, elderberry. Okay, a great plant, but a big plant. Okay, when you think about elderberry, real nice white flowers, really nice fruit. A lot of people use the fruit for jams and things. Again, likes wet areas, so if you have clay soils and that, elderberry is a great one as long as you have the space for it. Taxus canadensis, I really love this plant. All right, it's an evergreen. We don't have very many native evergreen shrubs. Okay, I love it as an understory. ground cover type shrub. It's loose enough. It maintains its height nicely. And again, it gives me a different complexion for the understory in either a woodlot or a wooded property site. Viburnum opulus variety americana. This used to be called Viburnum trilobum. Again, a Michigan native. The botanists, opulus was the European cranberry bush. The botanists who were studying this find out that they were both essentially the same genus species. The variety was different in the United States. And so there's one at the house that we're going to, but you'll find this in a lot of wet areas here in Michigan, in the Northern Peninsula. And the thing that's great about this, white flowers, really cranberry, cherry red fruit, really nice fall color, and the fruit are persistent through the winter. And one of the things when I was collecting these for seed is that when in the winter, when they're wet, they smell. All right. And so I was wondering why the birds weren't eating these all winter. And when I went up and got close to it, I figured, well, now I know why the birds aren't necessarily flocking to this. So be careful where you plant it. Make sure you sniff the fruit before you buy it, and see if that fragrance is something that's acceptable. Okay, there's a whole bunch of other native viburnums. Arrowwood, we'll see that. And Tatum, nannyberry, Viburnum lentego, you'll find that all over northern Michigan here, especially in kind of heavier wet areas. Nannyberry is a big plant. In fact, most of the viburnums that we're dealing with are large plants. Makes excellent shrub border materials. They're excellent for wildlife, for the birds with their fruit. And again, in terms of pruning, in many cases, we may need to clean them up and enhance them slightly, but in most cases not. Okay, so one of the things that I will talk about this again on Friday, every time you make a cut, before you actually make the cut, you should anticipate where growth is going to occur. And then after that growth comes out, you consider the consequence of that growth. And in some cases, I cut to initiate growth, but have to come back and cut it again once the growth starts to give me the lateral breaks or whatever that I may need for a particular plant. When I renovate a plant down into the ground and I get that new growth in May, and in June, I'm pruning it again in June to help to doctor up where those shoots are, eliminate some of them, make staggered cuts at different heights to give me lateral branches, because at that particular point, I'm making heading cuts. And every time I make a heading cut, I can anticipate 2 to 4 buds, 2 to 3 buds behind that cut to break and give me lateral branches. The amount of buds that break behind the cut varies with the species, but the more you prune one, the more you'll understand how that works. And again, pruning to me is it's my therapy, okay? Because I can make cuts, I can watch the plant grow, I can come back and work with Mother Nature on some species. And then in some cases, I say, you know what? It's time to regenerate Mother Nature, and I start from scratch. But in any event, hopefully we'll have some fun on Friday. There's a few species there that we can work with. And if you have any questions, I can answer them. Or if you want to talk about them, some of the questions you may have may be the same questions other people have, and we can do those on Friday. All right, Cheryl, that's it.
Hey, Bob, thanks so much. I love to prune and I learn new things. If people do have questions, you can throw them into the chat quickly and we'll get Bob to answer them. And otherwise, we'll be ending this up in a few minutes. So we still have some participants on. If you've got a question, throw it out on chat. Okay, nobody's chit-chatting on their chat right now. Okay, it has been great having Bob here. If you would like to join us Friday morning to watch him put these practices in action. Oh, let's see. We've got great presentation. Thanks from Cheryl. Candy said, thanks so much. Looking forward to Friday. Jane said, tons of information. Thank you. So I think the people on board here really enjoyed it. Go to Plant It Wild Today, just the number 2 at gmail.com. Ask to be invited to the pruning exhibition, and you will be given the address. And we want to keep, because it's private property, we don't want to just put that out in general. So Bob, thanks.
You know, anytime if you want a follow-up on this with just limiting, because it is a lot of information for the first time. And so if you would like something in the future, I can tailor it down to specific subjects or specific plants even, and or anything that you may find of interest to your group. And so thanks to Carolyn for making the connection. And if there's anything I can do for you in the future, just give me a call. And if the dates work, it's fine.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody. We'll see you again soon.